My name is Skylar Jenkins. I'm 31 years old, born and raised on the wide porches and deeper secrets of Charleston, South Carolina. My father, Henry Jenkins, was a gentleman of the old world, soft-spoken, bookish, the kind of man who wore cufflinks at breakfast, and taught me how to sail before I could spell ocean. When I was 17, he fell ill. Cancer, they said, quiet, cruel, and fast. By Christmas that year, he was gone. I remember how still the house felt without him, like a grand piano with broken strings. The will was read in January. I was the sole heir to the Jenkins Timber Company, 12,000 acres of Carolina pine, and the estate known as Laurel Haven. My mother had passed when I was a baby, so it was just me, a gentle boy who suddenly became a young man with everything, and yet, I had no one to share it with. I was careful with who I trusted. I didn't drink. I didn't gamble. I went to church on Sundays, worked alongside my staff on Mondays, and kept to my books more than I kept company. For years, I avoided every gold-digging debutante who wanted to make a man out of me with their designer smiles and hollow charm, until I met her, Cassandra Wells. She was visiting Charleston from Virginia, staying with her aunt, Mrs. Radley, who lived just 2 mansions down. I first saw her at the Christmas tree lighting in Town Square. She was wearing a green velvet coat and gloves the color of cranberry wine. Her laugh cut through the cold. It wasn't the laugh of a woman trying to be noticed. It was alive. I was entranced. Cassandra wasn't like the others. She didn't ask about my estate or my holdings. She asked about my garden, my books, my dog. She brought pecan pie to Laurel Haven 3 days before Christmas and stayed to help decorate the parlor tree. She didn't flinch when I told her about my father. In fact, she took my hand and said, "He'd be proud of the man you are." By New Year's, I was in love. By Valentine's, I proposed. She said yes under the oak tree by the pond. I gave her my mother's sapphire ring, and she wept into my chest like it meant the world. The town said I was finally healed, that I deserved this happiness. Even the Reverend told me, "Skylar, the Lord doesn't send storms without rainbows." But I didn't know the rainbow was painted in poison. The months that followed were beautiful. Or maybe I only remember them that way because I was trying so hard to believe they were real. Cassandra moved in. She brought warmth to Laurel Haven repainted the dining room, invited music into the halls again, hosted luncheons with the ladies' club, and kept a vase of fresh daisies in my study. I thought I had found joy. Not the loud, blazing kind, but the quiet, rooted one my father would have approved of. But then came the whispers. The maid overheard a call Cassandra laughing with someone named Victor, a strange name for a cousin. She claimed it was her lawyer, said she was drafting plans for her own antique business. I believed her. Of course I did. But the calls kept coming, and she started locking her writing desk. One evening, I returned from a timber auction early and found her in the library. She didn't hear me. She was reading one of my father's journals, muttering, "How did he not transfer it already?" Before slipping it into her handbag, the fire in my stomach was the kind I hadn't felt since my father's funeral. That night, I stayed awake. Something was wrong. By December, I'd begun my own investigations, quietly asking my father's old lawyer to review the will again, checking bank statements, tracking calls. What I found chilled me. Cassandra had been in contact with a private sanatorium in Virginia. She'd requested information on how to petition mental instability in adult spouses, citing early signs of delusion and paranoia, and the date she'd scheduled the evaluation, December 25, Christmas morning. I stared at that letter for what felt like hours. December 25, while the town would be opening presents and singing carols, my wife had planned to have me committed, declared mentally unstable, labeled insane, and carted off in a padded wagon like some deranged recluse. And once I was out of the picture, she'd have everything: Laurel Haven, the timber company, the inheritance, the family name. Suddenly, every sweet gesture she ever made soured in my memory. The pies, the daisy vases, the sudden interest in the library, all of it calculated. My first instinct was to confront her, to demand answers. But then I remembered something my father once said while we hunted in the woods. A man doesn't startle the fox when it's heading toward the trap. So I played my part. Sweet, soft Skylar, dutiful husband. I kissed her forehead each morning and nodded to her every evening. Meanwhile, I was laying the snare. First, I contacted Marshall and Crane, a legal firm my father trusted more than his own kin. I asked them to begin drafting emergency clauses quietly. I rewrote my will and placed every asset, every single one, into an irrevocable trust under my late mother's name. The trustees? A charitable foundation for widows and children. Cassandra would get nothing, not a dime. Then I contacted Dr. Emery at Charleston General, a physician who knew my father. I had him perform a discreet full evaluation on me, blood work, cognition tests, even written affidavits of my mental state, all signed, notarized, and time-stamped. I wasn't mad. I was methodical. Each night I'd eat the dinners Cassandra prepared, nod along to her plans for expanding the sitting room, listen to her talk about inviting her cousin Victor for the holidays. I never flinched, but inside, I was coiling like a spring. A week before Christmas, I had the head of Jenkins Timber quietly reshuffle our leadership board. Cassandra's name, which she had somehow charmed into a pending partnership clause, removed, legally scrubbed. I filed everything through the trust's proxy firm, so she wouldn't see it coming. And then, on Christmas Eve, I watched her dress in a silver gown and smile into the mirror like a woman who'd won. She asked if I was nervous about the holiday guests. I trust you completely, I told her, and I meant it. I trusted her to betray me, right on cue. That night, I pretended to go to bed early. I left the library light on and waited in the shadowed hallway. At exactly 11:30, she entered with a small leather folder tucked under her arm. I watched her slip documents into my desk drawer, falsified notes, perhaps. Something to suggest I'd been hallucinating, losing time. I didn't stop her, because every camera in the house was recording. Christmas morning arrived like any other, quiet, chilly, and dressed in gold light. Cassandra came into the breakfast room wearing pearls and said she had a surprise for me. I nodded. A knock came at the door. 2 men in suits. One introduced himself as Dr. Harold Klein from Laurel Haven Wellness Facility. He held a clipboard. We received a petition for psychiatric evaluation. I turned to Cassandra. Darling, did you arrange this? She smiled sweetly. It's just a precaution. You've been forgetful. I nodded. Well, I have a surprise too. I reached under the table and pulled out a brown envelope. Inside, copies of the trust filings, video evidence, and Dr. Emery's affidavit. Then I handed her the final document, annulment papers. Merry Christmas, Cassandra. She didn't even reach for the papers. Not at first. Her smile faltered. What is this? I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands calmly over the tablecloth. The fine china gleamed beneath the chandelier, and outside the frost-lined windows, Laurel Haven sat wrapped in perfect winter silence. That, I said, is an annulment, along with a packet of documents showing your attempted fraud, your premeditated use of a psychiatric institution to seize wealth, and a complete audit trail of your private bank transfers to a certain cousin Victor. Cassandra paled. She dropped the fork in her hand. You were spying on me? No, I replied. I was protecting myself and my family's name. She stood abruptly, her chair scraping hard against the floor. This is a mistake. Skylar, darling, I was worried about you. You were distant. You wouldn't talk. I cut her off gently. I was watching. Her voice sharpened. You can't just accuse me like this. You have no proof that. I slid the second envelope across the table. She opened it with shaking fingers. Inside were stills from the security cameras. Her placing documents in my drawer. Her on a phone call whispering about committing him before the new year. A copy of the check she mailed to the clinic. I didn't need a jury. She knew I had her. I always wondered. I said quietly, why? You were so eager to marry a man you barely knew. Now I know. And now, so do you. She staggered back a step, one hand gripping the mantle behind her. You were never supposed to be this sharp. You were supposed to be soft, easy. You were, knave. I offered. Yes, I was. But grief does funny things. Losing both my parents before 30, it taught me how cruel the world can be. I stood, walking over to the fireplace where our stockings hung, hers stitched with silver thread, mine with my mother's initials still embroidered at the top. My mother built Laurel Haven. My father expanded Jenkins Timber. And you thought you could walk in and inherit their world with a smile and a Christmas toast. Her voice dropped to a whisper. You loved me once. I turned to face her fully. I did. Or I loved who I thought you were. The doorbell rang again. 2 men stepped inside, Marshall and Crane's lead counsel, and a sheriff's deputy from Lexington County. I had filed everything in advance. No surprises, no yelling, just the quiet unraveling of her plan. You'll find that the deed to the estate has been placed in a long-term generational trust, I told her. You'll also find that your access to my accounts has been revoked, and your car's registration transferred back to the leasing agency. You leave here with what you came with, Cassandra? Her hands trembled. You planned this? I looked her dead in the eyes. I survived this. The deputy approached. Ma'am, I'm here to escort you off the property. You are not under arrest, but you are no longer permitted to remain at Laurel Haven. She didn't cry. Not right then. Cassandra North always poised, lifted her chin and gathered her coat with a cold dignity. As she stepped outside into the snow-covered path, she turned one last time. You'll regret this, Skylar. I didn't answer. I just watched the footprints she left melt slowly behind her. Inside, the fire crackled. My heart beat steady, and for the first time in years, I breathed. I wasn't just the quiet heir anymore. I was my mother's son, and I'd protected what mattered. After Cassandra left, Laurel Haven fell into a strange, golden quiet. The kind of silence that isn't empty but full of the things that had been reclaimed. That morning, I stood in the East Study, the same room where my father taught me how to read a blueprint and where my mother used to sip coffee at sunrise. Light filtered in through the tall arched windows, painting the floorboards honey gold. The annulment would be finalized in a week. The legal cleanup would take longer, but I had a team handling it, men and women I trusted, handpicked over the past 2 years. While Cassandra thought I was just resting or tending the estate, what she didn't know, what she never cared to notice, was that I had spent every one of those so-called idle days studying, shadowing our family lawyers, attending board meetings under an alias, even taking business correspondence courses under a false name so no one could warn her of what I was building. I wasn't idle. I was preparing, because something my father once told me had finally sunk in. The greatest revenge is not destruction, Skylar. It's resurrection. Of yourself, of what they thought they could bury. I didn't want to just survive Cassandra's betrayal. I wanted to rise above it so high, her schemes would seem like specks in the rearview mirror of a life lived. Right. Later that afternoon, I visited my mother's grave. It was Christmas Eve, and every year since her passing, I'd placed a single white camellia by her stone. I knelt down, brushing snow from the base of the marble. Mom, I said softly, I did it. I didn't say her name out loud. I didn't give breath to Cassandra's ghost in that sacred space. Instead, I told my mother about how I'd created the Sarah Jenkins Foundation in her honor, a foundation that now owned everything Cassandra thought she'd get her hands on, every acre of Laurel Haven, every share in Jenkins timber, every painting, patent, and penny that once belonged to the family legacy, transferred, sealed, untouchable. Cassandra had tried to play a game, but I was born into one and taught by masters. Back at the estate, I lit the hearth and poured a glass of mulled wine. Clara, our longtime housekeeper, and one of the only people who had quietly seen what was coming, sat across from me by the fire. She lifted her glass. To peace. I nodded. To peace and permanence. She smiled faintly. You remind me of your father more than ever tonight. Calm, certain. He used to say storms show you what's not anchored, I said. Cassandra was a storm, but I built the house. Outside, the wind picked up, stirring the snow in soft spirals. But inside, the fire burned warm, and the house stood whole, not just the building, the legacy, the man inside it. Me. I didn't just outsmart her, I outgrew her. The next few days moved like the first slow thaw after winter quiet, but transformative. There were letters to sign, trustees to meet, and boardrooms where my name now echoed with final authority, not as someone's heir, but as the man who saved the name he was born into. Cassandra was gone, but not idle. A week after Christmas, word reached me through one of my attorneys. She had tried to file a claim on a joint account, one that hadn't existed in months. The balance had been moved, its contents donated to children's hospitals across the state in my mother's name. The attempt failed, of course, but it told me something important. She still believed there was more to steal. I'd underestimated her hunger, perhaps, but not her nature, and that's what made me calm. I wasn't angry anymore, not even resentful. Because the real punishment for people like Cassandra isn't legal defeat, it's irrelevance. She had built her life like a net, flinging herself toward every wealthy name she could find. But nets tangle and eventually they tear. I, on the other hand, was building stone by stone, I invested in timber, yes, but also in education. I reopened the closed mill in Clay County under the Jenkins Foundation, offering jobs to 73 local workers just before New Year's Eve. Their joy was better than any courtroom victory. I also funded an art institute in the city, under my mother's maiden name Callahan. Cassandra would never trace it back to me, but it didn't matter. I wasn't doing it for her. I was doing it for every quiet soul who had been overlooked, for every name crossed off a guest list, for every voice Cassandra had tried to silence, including my own. By the second week of January, the last of her things had been boxed and shipped. I didn't open a single drawer. Let her keep the pearls. Let her wear the gowns she'd pretended to love me in. They were never real. That night, I walked into the West Wing, where my grandfather's study had stood locked for years. Inside, the furniture was covered in dust sheets. The air smelled like old paper and pine wood. I stood in front of the great desk, once belonging to Henry Jenkins, the man who had turned a sawmill into an empire. My father's father, the patriarch. I removed the cover, wiped the surface clean, and sat in the chair. Then I opened the drawer on the right. Inside was a leather-bound journal, my father's initials on the front. I hadn't seen it since the day he died. With slow hands, I opened it. The first page read, "Skylar, if you ever sit here, it means you've chosen to lead, not rule. There's a difference. Lead with humility, and let no one ever convince you your kindness is weakness." I closed the journal and leaned back. Cassandra had tried to manipulate that very kindness, to wear it like a mask, until she could claim it all. But kindness, when combined with clarity, becomes the sharpest weapon of all. She'd played for money, I played for legacy, and I had won. In the weeks that followed, I settled into a rhythm that was entirely mine, not dictated by appearances or whispered intentions. My home was quieter now, the echoes of Cassandra's presence fading into the velvet-lined walls and marble corridors. But in that quiet, I found clarity. One morning in February, a letter arrived from an address I hadn't seen in years: Rosebrook Manor, the retirement estate where my mother had spent her last few winters before she passed. It was from Mrs. Eleanor Finch, her closest friend. Inside was a note in her elegant script: "Your mother always said you'd become something more than a name on a ledger. I see now that she was right. Thank you for honoring her the way you did. The foundation already has helped 3 of our girls continue their education. She'd be proud." I read it twice, then once more. It hit me harder than any of Cassandra's betrayals, because in that moment, I realized the inheritance my mother left me had nothing to do with money. It was dignity. It was grace. It was the ability to move through storms without becoming the storm. Cassandra had never stood a chance at understanding that. She thought power came from appearance, from lavish entrances, diamond necklaces, and whispered envy. But real power is in restraint, in choosing not to destroy when you easily could. Still, justice has its ways. That spring, I received a call from a man named Henry Dalton, a lawyer from the city. He informed me that Cassandra was trying to contest the annulment, claiming emotional abuse and mental instability on my part. "She's hoping for a quick settlement," he added, "or perhaps a few headlines." I didn't flinch. "Let her try," I replied. I knew the documents we filed were airtight. The foundation was untouchable. The assets, transferred months before she ever caught wind of my plan, were now protected under a trust structure designed by some of the finest legal minds in the state. But beyond the legal armor, I had something else: her confession. Weeks before Christmas, I had asked a family friend, an old butler who had served my grandfather, to install a wire in Cassandra's parlor. It wasn't flashy, just a voice-activated recorder hidden in the rosewood clock on the mantel. The night she met with her cousin, the one she planned to use to have me committed, I had the entire conversation recorded. Her voice, clear as day, saying, "Once he's declared unstable, the estate transfers. It'll all be mine by Christmas morning." I never used that recording, never needed to, but I kept it, not out of revenge, out of memory. As a reminder of what love looks like when poisoned by greed, and what trust costs when handed too easily. The world didn't need to hear it, but I needed to never forget it. And when Mr. Dalton asked again if I wanted to issue a public statement or proceed with a countersuit, I declined. "Let her shout into the wind," I said. "I've already moved on." He paused for a moment. "You know," he said, "most men in your position would want to ruin her." I thought of my father's journal, of my mother's soft voice telling me, The loudest revenge is silence followed by success. I smiled. I already did. Time passed. Not quickly, not slowly, just with the calm certainty of a chapter turning. Spring melted into summer, and the estate began to feel more like a home than a monument. I had every room opened, the curtains pulled back, the furniture uncovered. The grand piano in the drawing room was tuned for the first time in 10 years. A family of bluebirds nested in the courtyard hedges. Laughter returned first from visiting children at the foundation, then from staff who stopped whispering and started living. And then one August afternoon, as I was walking through the vineyard, I'd replanted in my mother's memory. A woman called my name. Skylar? I turned. It was Lillian Moreau. She was once my childhood friend, the daughter of our groundskeeper. Years ago, we'd climbed trees and stolen peaches from the orchard together. But when my father died and the estate fell into Cassandra's grip, Lillian's family had quietly left. I hadn't seen her in over a decade, but there she was, hair now shorter, a sketchbook under one arm, and a warm, knowing smile on her face. I heard about the foundation, she said. Didn't believe it until I saw the articles myself. You've done something beautiful. I chuckled softly. It wasn't all noble. Some of it was just survival. She shook her head. No, it was honor. That's rarer. We walked the rows of vines together, talking of old memories and future dreams. She told me she was working as an art teacher in New Haven, and every summer, she came back to visit her grandmother's cottage on the edge of the old woods. I asked if she still painted. She nodded. But only for people who deserve the truth and color. I laughed. Does that include me? Maybe, she said, smiling again. One day, it felt peaceful, like my life had taken a long and bitter road, only to return me somewhere gentle. I didn't know then what would come of it, but something inside me knew. Not all chapters close with vengeance, some open with second chances. In early December, Cassandra's name returned to the papers not because of me, but because of herself. A series of failed investments, social gaffes, and finally her arrest in a foreign country for trying to bribe an official during an auction. The headlines were cruel, as headlines tend to be when the mask finally slips. I didn't comment, didn't even read the full story. She had become exactly what she feared the world would see, a fraud with nothing real left behind. I, on the other hand, was preparing for the first annual Jenkins Foundation Christmas Gala. It would be held not in a ballroom of the elite, but in the repurposed Wintergreen Community Hall, just down the hill from the estate. The same place where my father once organized toy drives, and my mother used to hand-sew costumes for the local nativity pageants. We invited every child from Steedy, Bernadette's orphanage, every struggling family in Lexington, every schoolteacher, every old caretaker who remembered my family's name with kindness. No gowns, no press, no donors' tables, just warmth and cider, and gifts wrapped by hand. I stood in the back corner, watching as the children opened toys donated by the very business Cassandra once tried to claim. Lillian was there too, painting faces and hanging garlands she made herself. I didn't need speeches or applause, just the quiet knowledge that this was legacy, not gold, not marble, but goodness. My mother would have cried, and my father would have poured cider for everyone. I didn't plan on ever hearing from Cassandra again, but just a week before Christmas, as snow dusted the gates of the estate and wreaths lined the town's storefronts, a letter arrived postmarked from a federal correctional facility in upstate New York. The envelope bore her signature in sharp, arrogant script. C. Jenkins. I didn't open it for days. Instead, I placed it on the mantel, right between a wooden ornament I'd carved as a child and my mother's last photograph. I stared at it for hours some nights, wondering what she could possibly say. Regret? Accusation? A plea for help? Christmas Eve came. Fires roared in hearts across town. The children from the foundation had spent the morning decorating cookies in the main kitchen, and Lillian had surprised me with a watercolor painting of the vineyard under moonlight, something she titled, "The Land We Came Back to." That night, as I sat alone in the study, I finally tore open the letter. It read, "Skylar, you think you've won. You always were naive, but now you think you're wise too. I suppose I underestimated how deep your mother's simplicity ran in your veins. This place, this money, it should have been mine. I could have made something of it, something grand. You threw it away for orphans and school teachers. One day, when you're old and forgotten, maybe you'll realize that love isn't enough. Power is what endures. Influence, status. These children you coddle will forget you. And me, I'll rebuild. You may have burned the bridge, but the world has many doors. Merry Christmas. See, I folded it gently, placed it back in the envelope, and tucked it into the back drawer of my desk along with other ghosts of the past. There was no satisfaction in her anger, only a quiet reminder of who I could have become. Had I let bitterness make my choices, that night, after the house had gone still, I wandered into the orchard. Moonlight glazed the frost-covered grass. From afar, the town bells chimed midnight. I stood beneath the same tree where Cassandra once told me she loved me, and where I almost believed her. I closed my eyes and whispered, "Merry Christmas, Skylar." To the boy I had once been, he had survived. Christmas morning was different now, not filled with extravagance, but with meaning. The foundation delivered baskets to every home in the valley. Lillian handed out toys from the back of the carriage. I sat in the children's reading room, helping Clara, a brilliant little girl with wide eyes and a stutter, learn to read the first page of A Christmas Carol. She looked up at me and said, "Mr. Jenkins, do you think people can really change?" I smiled and replied, "Only if they're brave enough to tell the truth to themselves first." She nodded like it was the wisest thing she'd heard. Later that day, Lillian pulled me aside. "You know," she said, "you don't always have to carry everything alone. You're allowed to be happy too." And I realized for the first time in years I already was .no headlines. No scandal, just healing, and hope, and the hum of carols sung by voices that never once asked me for anything. I spent most of that winter watching things grow again quietly, patiently, not vineyards or businesses, but people. Broken people like I once was. The foundation's programs expanded. We added reading rooms, music halls, and even a small woodworking shed behind the main building. I taught the kids how to carve tiny ornaments and toy trains, just as my father once taught me. The sound of laughter returned to the grounds like a song I had forgotten the words to, but every so often, I'd catch my reflection in a window or a puddle and wonder if things had turned out differently. If I had believed Cassandra's lies instead of following my instincts, what would have become of me? Would I be just another bitter man with a hollow legacy? One morning in early March, I received an invitation, hand-delivered, sealed in dark wax. It was from the Board of Trustees at Grantham and Elroy, the very law firm that once helped Cassandra draft her quiet takeover scheme. They were now requesting that I serve as honorary speaker at their Christmas philanthropy gala for the upcoming year, the very same event Cassandra once tried to use to showcase our joint legacy. Irony, it seems, is the universe's most precise instrument. I declined politely, not out of anger, but because the real work I was doing could never be measured by applause or champagne. Instead, I made arrangements for the foundation's senior students to attend in my place. They would speak about the work they'd done, the lives they were rebuilding, the futures they were crafting with their own hands, and they'd wear custom-stitched coats from our local seamstress, each one with a phrase embroidered on the inside, "Nothing taken can't be rebuilt." Later that week, I received news from a friend at the county register. Cassandra had filed for early release. Her lawyers argued that her sentence had been served long enough for a non-violent crime, and she had plans to restart her life. I didn't react, just closed the file and kept walking. I no longer feared her shadow. What she had done was a storm, yes, but I had built shelter since then. A fortress made of character and community, not contracts. Christmas that year came with its usual snow, its lights, its memories. We held our own celebration at the orchard grounds. The children decorated the giant oak tree with paper stars and cinnamon sticks. Lillian baked 14 pies. Clara recited a poem she'd written herself about second chances and snow angels. Then the choir sang, not polished, not perfect, but true. And as their voices filled the valley, I realized the full arc of my journey. I had loved, I had been betrayed, and I had risen, not by striking back but by standing taller. Cassandra once said love was weakness. That charity was a mask, but standing there, surrounded by lives that had found light because I refused to dim mine, I knew she was wrong. She didn't just lose the estate or the inheritance, she lost what truly mattered, because in the end Christmas isn't about what you hold in your hands, it's about what you give from your heart. The following spring, the Jenkins Foundation received its largest endowment yet, a grant from a national trust that had followed our story in a local paper. I was reluctant to even take the interview. but the journalist insisted. He asked one question that stuck with me for weeks afterward. Mr. Jenkins, do you think your revenge is complete? I paused, not because I didn't know the answer, but because I had to consider what revenge even meant to me anymore. If revenge was about ruining Cassandra, then it ended the day she left the estate in handcuffs. If it was about reclaiming my father's legacy, it ended the moment I signed the foundation into his name. But if it was about rebuilding something better than what was lost, then I realized I wasn't done. Because healing isn't a final act, it's a living process. 1 week before the next Christmas, I returned to my childhood home, not the grand estate, but the cottage my mother grew up in, tucked behind the orchards. I hadn't been back since I was a teenager, but something pulled me there. Inside, I found old sketchbooks my father had used for toy ideas. There were blueprints for music boxes, notes about building sleighs from recycled wood, and a list titled Christmas Gifts for Skylar, age 10. At the bottom of the page, he'd written, "Give him what money can't buy: time, truth, and love." I closed the notebook and wept, not from sadness, but from fulfillment. The next day, I made one final move. I signed over the remaining Jenkins estate, yes, the very mansion Cassandra once hoped to claim, into a community trust. It would become a creative learning center for orphaned and at-risk youth. The ballroom would host art shows, the garden would grow produce for the nearby shelter, and the grand hall would become a performance space for young musicians and poets. I hosted the inaugural Christmas Eve concert myself. I wore my father's old coat and stood on the same steps where I once watched Cassandra smile at reporters, pretending to be the future of the Jenkins name. But this time, the lights weren't for show. They were for the kids, for the families, for the people who had no place at other tables. I gave a short speech, simple, honest. Sometimes life takes more than it gives, but if you hold on long enough, you can become the kind of person who gives more than they ever lost. Applause followed, and tears, and as I stepped down from that stage, a little girl no older than 6 ran up and hugged my leg. "Thank you, Mr. Jenkins," she whispered. "I want to build toys too." I smiled. "Then let's get started. A few questions to reflect. Do you think Skylar was right to choose rebuilding over revenge? What would you have done if someone tried to declare you insane for money? Can love ever recover after betrayal, or does something entirely new take its place? Subscribe to more revenge stories. Share, like, comment.